Anyway, I'm also not a chiropractor. I've been working with Heidi and her group with last 7 years, Heidi, right? And also I've been adding a few things into the research we did together, because my approach is a little bit different. Like, I don't take EMG, what it shows, classically shows what it's supposed to be, but we look further into it using single motor units. I'll show you what things might be different when you look at it deep down into the surface EMG. Anyway, the idea here is to look at the chiropractic manipulation on neuromuscular system. So you could do such a thing, for instance, in animal models, but and you can stick all kinds of needles into animal's brain or spinal cord, etc. But you have to somehow manipulate the animal. It has to be anesthetized. So when you anesthetize an animal, all the synaptic potentials change. So you really have to do it in human. But how do you do it in human? You have to really give an input into a person and take an output. And I take brain and the spinal cord as like a black box. So anything might be happening there. You have to work out from input parameters and output parameters and work out what's happening in the middle. So first, we need to stimulate human nervous system we do several things, like Imran talked about stretch reflex, so mechanical point of view, we have to stimulate. Electrically, we can stimulate. We stimulate various areas. Magnetically, we stimulated the brain magnetically, because electrically stimulate the brain, we used to do that in 1980s. You almost feel like somebody is hitting your head with a huge hammer. But with magnetic stimulation, you only feel a tickle. So that's a difference. That's why we use magnetic stimulation nowadays rather than electrical stimulation. And of course, when you record the output, then you have to work out the black box, what's going on in the black box, with a control treatment that is done by Imran usually. You are quite right, Turkish girls really liked your treatment. I don't know why, but they did. And the Heidi does the chiropractor treatment. So in between the two, we have to, and also subjects don't know who is really the doctor of chiropractor. So you have to try and make it as much double blind as possible. Otherwise, it could be just a placebo effect, the entire thing you are looking at. So you really have to be very careful. I really have to stress on this when you do chiropractic manipulation. So recording output of the nervous system, you use surface electromyography, which I've got a lot of doubts, actually. I'll show you why. And single motor units, which is much more relevant, because each action potential you record from needles stuck into the muscle represent individual action potentials in the spinal cord motor neurons. So as if you are sticking a needle into the spinal cord and recording from the spinal cord. And it's a simple technique, putting a needle into the muscle, and our subjects walk out without any pain and $50 in their pocket. So that's quite, and they queue for the next treatment. So it's quite an easy effect, but it gives you a lot more than what I'll show you. Spinal cord might really lead you into an erroneous areas. And then characterize with and without this control treatment. So I'm going to talk about 5 different things and summarize everything. When I've talked about TMS, I'm going to summarize and take home messages regarding that one, etc. So I'm going to hope that I can finish. I've got about 35 minutes now instead of 40 minutes. Right. So first, a silent period. Why do I talk about silent period? Imran already talked about TMS, and he mentioned about silent period. But silent period has been implicated for many disorders of the brain, because it's supposed to be a silent or something happening in the brain which we should work about. And certain disorders, it gets smaller, shorter, and certain disorders, it gets longer and disappears, etc. So there's a lot of talk about, thousands of papers on the silent period. So we have a different look. And you'll see at the end that silent period people will be silent, because there is no silent period. We are coming to that. Anyway, so basically when you stimulate, I'll go very fast on this. Imran already talked about it. When you stimulate the cortex, motor cortex, and you record from a muscle, you get a potential called motor evoked potential, or MEP. That's what it is, motor evoked potential, because of course it crosses over. So that's what we are doing it. And depending on the actually amplitude and also dissipation of this motor evoked potential, you can say many things. Like, for instance, in the case of bicep brachii, it's quite dissipated. You can see that. That means downgoing cortical spinal pathways have got different conduction velocities, so it actually dissipates. Whereas here, it looks as though they are all conducting about the same time, the same velocity, so therefore it's got a synchronized output. So you can say many things really by looking at these MEPs. And of course, when you do treatment, you can change some of these. You can talk about what's happening in the black box, as I described in the beginning. But this is the silent period, which I'll be talking a little more about just now. Silent period has been implicated, as I said, for many disorders and supposed to be in the cortical silent period. That's why it's known as CSP, so cortical silent period. But I thought through some experience we've got using surface EMG, there are many, I shouldn't say many, there are some basic errors in the surface EMG which may lead you regarding the wiring of the central nervous system. I'll show you why. This is how you record surface EMG. Stuck electrodes on the skin surface, which is quite a simple thing. You all do that. Of course, to quantify it, this is just n equals 1. This is where the stimulation is given. Something is happening there, but you are not really sure what's going on. So the idea is to full way rectify it, so you can start to see what is really going on. Otherwise, you can't see any inhibition in surface EMG. This is still stimulation of one stimulus, and if you average many of them, average rectified or rectified average EMG is called, you then see something going on. But we often wondered whether this inhibition followed by excitation, the excitatory part maybe comes from here. It's almost delayed action potentials giving you an excitation, which people make a lot about. So what we can do to resolve it, we thought we can stick needles into the muscle and try and resolve like cortical silent period or other silent periods, whether or not they are real events. So these are single motor units stuck into the muscle, just a needle stuck into the muscle, bipolar wires, of course, and each one of these representing an action potential in the motor neuron. And then you can build histograms. For instance, this is where the stimulus is given. Sorry, I left this in Turkish. I recently gave a talk on this in Turkish, so I might suddenly start to talk in Turkish. I'm sorry about that. So this is a simple stimulus, a single stimulus. These are action potentials. You convert it into counts, or a peristimulus time histogram is called. Then if you give hundreds of stimuli, it gives you a shape. It's almost like what you see in cortical silent period. There is an MEP there, followed by inhibition and another, etc., etc. But then you see that a synchronous event here seems to repeat itself several times, what Imran called probably medium latency reflex or long latency reflex. They may all be artifacts of the initial synchronization. So how are we going to resolve that? So we came up, since 1999, I went to 1998, in fact, I went to several times to to study brain slices in Seattle Powers lab, Randy Powers lab, and we've shown that instead of doing a peristimulus time histogram, if you build peristimulus frequencygram, you actually try to see whether or not this inhibition is less number of action potentials or is really truly inhibition. Because when an EPS, when an excitatory potential occurs, it's got a shadow in the back. Some spikes will not occur in the shadowing part, just like here in this part. But if you plot it in surface EMG or in spike or histogram, you would think that this is an inhibition because there is a smaller number of action potentials. But nevertheless, their frequencies are high. When frequency is high, that means excitation. So that's what we thought we can correct the entire thing by building frequencygram. For instance, now the silent period, which you think silent period there, is actually a lessened number of action potentials, but nevertheless their frequencies are high. That means it's actually a falling phase or excitatory postsynaptic potential rather than an inhibition. So this is all theory. Then I thought, of course, I have to prove this, so I went to Randy Powers' lab, and I suggested that we should actually insert a known synaptic potentials into a motor neuron, and in the same time record action potentials from motor neuron and average it either through almost like surface EMG histogram point of view or frequencygram point of view, and trying to see which one actually gives you the actual synaptic potential. Because since we are studying a black box, our methodology has to be exact. Otherwise, we don't know what we are doing. Since we are not sticking needles everywhere, our methodology of studying this black box has to be correct. So that's what we did. We inserted a needle into a motor neuron and gave what is called a current pulse. Current pulse, actually, if you just give it as such, it gives you action potentials, a bit like Turkish soldiers, following each other at equal space, which is not really action potentials you normally get in human subjects. So what you need to do is to insert noise. And noise parameters, we got it from cat motor neurons, and we inserted it together. Then action potentials actually generated interval histogram looks exactly like human motor unit interval histogram. Now we can use that as a simulator and work out, now insert further synaptic potentials, which we did. So for instance, insert EPSPs or IPSPs along with it and average the output of the action potentials using histogram or frequencygram and see which one is giving you the correct information about the synaptic potential. And when we did that, and we finally built, for instance, this red one is inserted EPSP. This is into a motor neuron, and these blue lines are action potentials turned into histogram. You can see that if you build a histogram, it really doesn't represent the inserted synaptic potential. It increases, a bit like MEP in the when you stimulate the magnetic stimulation, like motor evoked potential, followed by a silent period. But nevertheless, during that period, excitatory postsynaptic potential was continuing. So it's not really representing what's going on. Anybody looks at, without knowing that red line, anybody looks at the histogram will think, oh yes, there is an excitation followed by inhibition, another excitation, another inhibition, like mid-latency excitation, long latency excitation, etc. They would say there are 5 different pathways. And you look at, because we are looking at a black box, we don't know what's going on, then you would have to work out these pathways. Some are going through the cerebellum, some are going through the cortex, etc. You will have to make a story, because otherwise you can't publish it. If you show this thing, significantly excitatory, significantly inhibition, etc., then you have to make 5 different stories. But there is only one story. So when you build a frequencygram, you can see that it becomes like an envelope. It follows it exactly like the inserted potential. Therefore, it was really a revolutionary finding. Now, all of the researchers actually seriously doing reflex research are using this particular methodology, which we published several papers, including this is a review article in Trends in Neuroscience, reviewing 4 different papers we published previously. But bottom of the line is that you have to use single motor units and convert it into frequencygram to be able to see exactly what's going on in the human nervous system. Okay, so how do we use this particular thing in spinal manipulation? So what is spinal manipulation to do with it? So I go to that. So anyway, I just pass over that. So we were looking at silent period, thinking that it's actually silence, and it's silence in the brain, and it changes depending on people's disorders, etc. But is it really true? So when we look at it with spinal manipulation and with pre-spinal manipulation, post-spinal manipulation. And you can see that the spinal manipulation increased the first area, and these are histogram. Sorry, this is histogram showing the silent period. But when you look at the frequencygram, there is no silent period. It's the frequency is high up there. So that means spinal manipulation also, through frequencygram, we see that spinal manipulation gives you an extra peak here. Instead of just one peak, there's an extra peak. So there's something going on which you would never have guessed if you didn't use the frequencygram. And when you do, for another example, the spinal manipulation increasing the MEP-like events, here before treatment, or before manipulation, after manipulation. So it increases dramatically the frequency content of it. And there is no inhibition there, because if there is an inhibition here, there will be low discharge rate, low frequency discharge rate, which isn't. When you do see some, they are high frequencies. So that means it's a falling phase of, falling phase of excitatory event. So there is no silent period. So silent period, people will become silent after I think we publish this particular paper, which is almost ready to send to the journal. And this is now control. Of course, this is the Imran control, pre-control and post-control. We didn't see any difference between them. In fact, pre-control, there was more MEP compared to the post-control. So that means really, bottom line is, conclusion one from TMS studies, spinal manipulation reduces cortical silent period, duration of it, but we know that it's not a silent period anymore. Increases the size and number of I waves, which are these straight lines. If you saw on the graph, they are called actually I waves or indirect waves. It alters net excitability of low threshold motor units. So this is the first part. And secondly, we looked at the spinal excitability using H-reflex. Of course, H-reflex you are all familiar with. A few of the speakers already talked about H-reflex. So I'll just basically show you what H-reflex is. This is a reflex route. Of course, you have to stimulate and record. This is my black box. So in this case, we are stimulating in the popliteal fossa, tibial nerve, and recording from soleus, both with wire electrodes and surface electrodes. So basically, this is a simulation of H-reflex. What you do is, in the middle of this is the stimulation is going to be, this is the tibial nerve and the spinal cord, and this is the soleus muscle. Just see it this way. This is our stimulus, and stimulus generates an action potential in the thick myelinated fibers, which are the 1A fibers, goes up, then goes all the way there and generates H-reflex, because it's a reflex. And then if you increase the stimulus intensity a little bit more, it stimulates the thinner fibers, which are the motor axons. It generates the M wave. And if you build this, if you increase the stimulus intensity against the M wave amplitude, that's how it looks like. You increase the stimulus intensity. First thing appears is the yellow one, which is really that pathway, because thick fibers are easier to stimulate. If you start to increase your stimulus current, the first fibers are stimulated are thick myelinated fibers. And thickest myelinated fiber in human body is muscle spindle primary endings. So this 1A fibers. That's what you start to see their activation here. And if I increase the stimulus intensity further, then H-reflex increases, then start to decrease. And during that time, M response, or the motor evoked potential response, increases. And finally, if M response increases, H-reflex disappears completely. I'll explain to you later what this particular falling is about. But basically what we have done is, we have done this particular thing, this is the details of it, with and without spinal manipulation in normal subjects. Well, really I want to call them normal subjects because they are subclinical subjects, as we agreed. There were some problems with the spinal cord, right, Heidi? But at the time of treatment, or at the time of manipulation or control manipulation, there was no pain. So they were just subclinical. So in the subclinical people, when we look at the H-reflex, basically that's what we saw, that the area of the H-reflex didn't change much, but threshold of the H reflex really reduced quite a lot. So that means small motor neurons, which are activated by 1A easiest, their excitability is increased. Small motor neuron excitability is increased. That's what this particular slide shows. Then when you look at the stroke patients, we've done similar experiments. There was some change between threshold 50% of H reflex size as well as the slope, but we didn't get any actually significance in stroke patients. Elite athletes, also we did get some changes, but standard errors were so big that there was no significance. Basically, when you summarize those conclusions three regarding spinal excitability, that's what we can say. In normal subjects, spinal manipulation resulted in reduced H reflex threshold, it was significant. Reduced size of H reflex, it was non-significant. But stroke patients, no significance at all in any of the parameters, even though there was some change. Maybe we need more subjects. And elite athletes, taekwondo players, also no changes. Therefore, I should just change in H reflex threshold only occurs in normal subjects, that is the subclinical subjects, following spinal manipulation, and there was no change in those. So effectively, you don't have to find always significances. I mean, when you do find no significance, you need to bring it out and talk about it. As you can see that three different groups, only change occurring in the subclinical level. Thirdly, we looked at the cortical drive. How do you look at cortical drive? Cortical drive is actually looked at using the same setup, but this setup, like stimulating the tibial nerve, recording from soleus muscle, but doing the same procedure as you've seen before, and also doing all this, but when you get to the end of this, when you increase the stimulus intensity, the highest level, when the H reflex disappears and M response is biggest, that means a lot of the antidromic action potentials are colliding with orthodromic action potentials of the reflex. So that's why reflex start to disappear when the M response increases. Because there is an antidromic action potential you generate in alpha axons, which collide actually there, somewhere here, so that they knock each other out. But you still see M response because on this side there is no clash. Only the reflex disappears, but the M response actually grows. But when you come to this level, if you ask the subject to contract that particular muscle as hard as they can, you see what's known as V. That's not Victory, but this is volitional response. Volitional response means that you send a lot of action potentials from your motor cortex, which overcome some of this collision, so that actually H reflex can still go express itself. So there is a bump here you see, or you will see, which is known as V for volitional, when the motor cortex is activated. The bigger the V is, bigger number of action potentials being sent from the motor cortex to that particular muscle. So if we can increase the V response with chiropractic manipulation, that means cortex is allowed to send more action potential to that particular muscle. So that's exactly what we have done. So this is pre and post. This is manipulation. As you can see that pre, it was a dashed line, and post is almost double the size. And pre and post control is almost identical. When you look at overall responses, actually there was a significant increase as a result of spinal manipulation. That means people feel more secure to push their particular muscle to their maximum limits. Force also increases. You'll see that in the next few slides. In stroke patients also, V wave increases dramatically. And then also, taekwondo athletes, it increases dramatically. So these are all recently published, actually 2018, just a few weeks ago. So the conclusion from cortical drive are, in normal subjects, it increases V response. That means the person becomes more ready to push that particular muscle. We can't really tell you exactly what's happening, how is this happening, whether the input or the feedback from that particular muscle is allowing more motor neurons to be activated, or is it coming from the cortex? Is actually cortex is driving further into the muscle? Because when you record from the muscle, you don't exactly know if it's coming from the cortex or in the spinal cord, but you know it's the drive starting from the cortex. Some way the modulation is occurring. So in stroke patients also increase, and also in elite athletes also increase. That means muscles are becoming more, or the person is becoming more ready to push that particular muscle to its limits as a result of spinal manipulation. The improvements in spinal cortical drive following spinal manipulation are likely attributed to increased descending drive or modulation in synaptic effect. So it can happen in both ways, either modulation of synaptic efficacy or increase in descending drive. Fourthly, we looked at the muscle strength with and without, with control treatment, as well as with chiropractic manipulation. And that, of course, that absolute force change, stroke patients, again, stroke patients increase their absolute force compared to control treatment, as well as Taekwondo athletes. And we originally knew that it was in our normal subjects there was also increase. So if you summarize this fourth point, muscle strength, spinal manipulation resulted in increased muscle strength in normal subjects and in stroke patients, as well as in elite athletes. So muscle strength is increasing, and previously we knew that in the third conclusion that drive is increasing from cortical drive. So that means muscle strength and cortical drive both increasing. And again, we can't pinpoint where this is happening. Either is through increased descending drive or modulation in synaptic efficacy, or it could be a bit of both. And finally, because I'm a dentist by training, I wanted to look at the bite force, and Heidi also suggested that they often treat some bite force problems. So we thought, okay, let's look at the bite force, whether or not bite force will change as a result of spinal manipulation and control manipulation. And this is the setup. Actually, this is quite a nice drawing because it shows exactly what we had. It's two tungsten bars, and you get the impression, plastic impression, individualized impression, so that people don't really break their teeth. It's a bit like when your impression is taken in dentists for dentures. And we placed it on top of these steel bars and asked subjects to bite as hard as they can. Of course, I mean, and then you average the results. And sham intervention, there's not really much change, but spinal manipulation increased the bite force again significantly. And that lasted for at least 1 week, because we just followed it for 1 week. So as a result of this particular study, we showed that spinal manipulation resulted in increased maximum voluntary bite force. This increase stayed up for 1 week. Following control intervention, maximum voluntary bite force decreased and stayed decreased for 1 week. So this is manipulation increasing it, control intervention done by Imran again is decreasing it. So well done, Imran. Improvement in bite force following spinal manipulation, again, due to either descending drive or synaptic efficacy. So we don't know still exactly to pinpoint exactly what is changing. So one more thing I wanted to say before I finish, because normally you all know about this particular thing, that in our sensory cortex, our hands and our face is represented quite large areas. That means many neurons, when you stimulate head or the fingers, a lot of areas in the cortex light up. That means they are well represented, well innervated. But back, and especially where you touch during spinal manipulation, back and the neck is hardly represented at all. But there is a very recent study showing, and actually because of that, you ignore the skin receptors in the back, because 2-point discrimination there is much higher compared to the lip or the fingertips, for instance. 2 millimeters there, at the back is 36 millimeters. That means very small number of receptors exist in the back and the neck. However, This particular publication in 2014 showed that in the insular cortex, which is actually still a cortex, but is in the folded area, the back and the neck is represented in a huge area. And this area, this is supposed to be sort of a pleasurable center of the body. So that means when you are touching people on their head and back, you are giving them some pleasure. Also, there are some temperature receptors as well. Bit like this. Where I've seen a lot of people seeing each other, they're just hugging each other. They're not touching their legs or their arms. They are actually hugging each other. That means there are some receptors there, even though low number, as we have shown, as they've shown, that they actually go to the insular cortex and represented quite a large area in the represented you can see back, shoulder, upper arm, and all this, even the leg. It's all that area which was unrepresented in this area. It's only shown here, for instance, is unrepresented in the sensory cortex, but it's very well represented. And insular cortex is now starting to get really important. That means when you are touching people with the temperature as well as with skin receptors, it's going straight into the insular cortex, and it's giving them pleasant sensation. Both, this is called the C fibers, coming from small number of receptors here, but nevertheless very important receptors, and they go straight into the insular cortex and gives you comfort and pleasurable feeling. Maybe part of this is due to that. The treatment is due to that, but we don't know. We'll have to check this because it's such a new finding. So to summarize the 5 different things which I talked about, chiropractic manipulation generates in cortical silent period, changes in cortical silent period, H reflex pathway, muscle strength, V wave, I wave, which is indirect waves, bite force, short hair and warp receptors in the back. That's why I added at the end. And therefore, it can change the human nervous. I'm saying human nervous and neuromuscular system, not just neuromuscular system, because it seems to affect the nervous system as a whole as well. And work is done by all these researchers in New Zealand Chiropractic College, Aalborg, as well as Koç University, Istanbul, Turkey. Thank you for listening.